he doesn't know where to manoeuvre, which is good because that means he doesn't have the initiative. The pace is being dictated by the international community and by the Ukrainians. And he's hurting.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, former Colonel Philip Ingram, MBE, a former military intelligence officer with more than 26 years of experience in the UK Armed Forces and a former NATO planner. He's now a military analyst and respected commentator. Philip, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
Wanted to begin with the latest news that President Biden is now going to allow Ukraine to use American-supplied ATACMS missiles to strike targets inside the Kursk Oblast of Russia. How significant a moment is that?
It's very significant because Ukraine has been asking for the use of these missiles to be unlocked even further. And I'm not sure whether the wording is just inside the Kursk Oblast or against troops that are, or Russian capability that's planning to attack into it. It I think is the precursor for the expansion of that authorization to use Western supplied missiles over a much longer range throughout Russia itself. So hopefully we'll quickly see the restrictions that have been on the Storm Shadow or the French equivalent, the Scalp missiles, eased off so that they can be used by the Ukrainians as well.
Now, that's very interesting. You do think this is the precursor to that happening? You don't think this is as far as it will go?
No, if you look at everything that's developed over we're getting close to 1,000 days of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation. We've always pushed the boundaries a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more, and there's never been an implication because of it. So, main battle tanks have come in, Western trainings come in, Western aircraft have come in, Western air defense systems have come in, and the Russians have done nothing. The Ukrainians have invaded physical territory inside Russia, and nothing has happened. This is the next step. So it's logical that it'll go further, and it's just when. If I was in a position, I'd take the gloves off today because I don't think there are any major implications, apart from more Ukrainians are dying whilst we wait to make this final decision.
I mean, predictably, the Kremlin is not impressed by this decision. I think one Russian senator's come out and said this is a precursor to World War III. I take it you would say that is just classic Russian hyperbole, and that actually, as you've just outlined, every time there has been an apparent escalation by the West, if you want to use that language, Russia doesn't respond.
Well, exactly. And Vladimir Putin himself has said that the supply of these missiles and their use inside Russia would be seen as the West directly attacking Russia, and Russia would be at war with the West. We're going to see that disappear completely. There'll be lots more nuclear saber rattling and other saber rattling and everything else, and comments coming out from different places, but it'll fizz away as it always has done. Putin doesn't have the ability to take it any further. He's not going to go down the nuclear line, as we've seen reported in some newspapers where prime ministers were preparing for that, because if he does, he will lose the tacit support he relies on, in particular from China, but also from the likes of India, Pakistan, where he's exporting a lot of his crude oil to be refined into petrol, and then petrol and diesel, and then sold back to us again.
Just looking at what difference these ATACMS will actually make operationally. I mean, in Kursk, we've seen Russia recapture about a third of the territory that Ukraine seized over the summer. Do you think this will potentially put an end to any Russian advances in Kursk? I mean, what kind of difference do you think they'll make?
It'll make a big difference in that what it'll do is it'll push Russia's ability to concentrate its logistics, concentrate its troops, concentrate its equipments close to where it wants to then use them in a tactical battle, and it's going to have to push them back further. ATACMS, the ones that I think they're going to allow Ukraine to fire, has got a range of about 190 miles, 330 kilometers. And that's a long distance from a tactical perspective to push back those elements that you're needing to support the close battle. And that will have a major impact on Russia's ability to concentrate its force, and therefore will allow Ukraine to have much more effect with the tactical weapons that it's got. At the moment, the Russians are quite safely concentrating everything very close to where they need to engage it. When there's a problem, they take another force and push it in quite quickly. Now it's going to take them hours and hours. And whilst it's moving down those routes, it's vulnerable as well. So this is quite significant in the support to the tactical battle. At an operational level, it's sending a very clear message to the Russians that the West is continuing to take its gloves off and allow Ukraine to fight freely.
And then let's say the logical next step is followed and President Biden, before he leaves office, allows long-range missiles such as Storm Shadow and Scalp to be used on other targets inside Russia by Ukraine. What difference do you think that will make? I mean, people talk about it being a game changer. We've heard that language used before around a whole range of weaponry, including things like the F-16s. I'm always skeptical when people talk about game changers, but how big a difference do you think that would make?
No one capability is going to be a game changer. So the F-16s were never going to be, the main battle tanks were never going to be, the use of Storm Shadow Scalp outside where it's being used at the moment. The Ukrainians are using them very successfully inside Russian-held territory inside Ukraine at the moment. But what it'll do is, again, start to push that Russian capability even further back. It'll allow Ukraine to try to start to attack the airfields that Russia is using to provide close air support into its operations in Ukraine and covering its operations in the Kursk region. It will start to push some of the strategic bomber sites further back so that Ukraine gets an even longer warning time as to when the strategic bombers are taking off to launch their missiles against Ukraine, as we saw happen only a couple of days ago, where hundreds were launched in. It will stop the drone sites where the Shahed 136 Iranian-supplied drones, now manufactured in Russia, are being launched in huge numbers, because Ukraine will be able to identify where those launch sites are and respond to those very quickly indeed, and deal with the launchers and deal with the sites. So it will cause the Russians a real headache when it comes to prosecuting the operations they're enjoying prosecuting at the moment with virtually no threat.
Why do you think it has taken so long, Philip? Because, the Ukrainians have been calling for the use of long-range missiles to be sanctioned inside Russia for months now. And as with so much throughout this entire conflict, there seems to be a delay between Ukraine calling for certain weaponry to be allowed to be used and then the West granting permission for it to be allowed to be used. I mean, had this been granted, several months ago, we could be looking at a very different situation on the front line. So why do you think it has taken this long for President Biden to agree to this?
This is where we get the complexity of not just international politics, but domestic politics then interfering with international politics. I don't think President Biden was going to do anything that could influence the US presidential election one way or the other. The polls were saying up until the election happened that it was very, very close indeed. And the last thing that he wanted to do was bring out anything from a domestic policy perspective or an international policy perspective that would potentially push domestic voters against the Democrats and pro-Trump. Well, he didn't succeed in that, and therefore too many Ukrainian lives have been lost. But again, we're seeing that across Europe. We've seen problems inside the German government. The German government has effectively just collapsed, and we'll see elections early New Year. We're seeing the same across France. So there's this delicate, and across the rest of the EU, there's this delicate balance between making international policy, but how that impacts on the growing right-wing movement of politics across Europe. This is where the UK is sort of standing out slightly differently to other countries across Europe, because it's pushed itself more left-wing in its approach. But again, if you look at what our new government is doing, they are being much more cautious in providing authorizations, because I think if, dare I say it, and I'm probably going to swear here, Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, then the Storm Shadow missiles, he would have turned around and said to the Ukrainians, just use them, and then would have gone out to the international community and said, we've done it, there's no problem, what are you going to do to me? We've got a much more cautious approach at the moment.
It's really interesting that actually you mentioned what's happening in Germany and the collapse of the government there, and we're expecting these new elections very soon. How significant is that? And do you think that is being under-discussed in the context of the war in Ukraine? Because, Germany's role, particularly if America ends up, and we'll come on to Trump and what his administration may do in a moment, but if America does scale back its military aid for Ukraine, then it is going to be incumbent on the UK, France, and Germany in particular to increase European funding for Ukraine. And so really the consequences of the next German election will be enormous, potentially as important for the war in Ukraine as the consequences of the US election.
Oh, very much so. And it's not just funding, it's developing the defence industrial bases to be able to maintain those supplies that are needed. This isn't all about money. Now, that's good for the German economy. But what we're saying is the German government will always be a coalition government. and therefore it's the minority elements of it that will have the biggest say. And because where you've got something like that, that then leaves the final government structure up for influence by external actors. So Russia will see this as a perfect opportunity to try and find those Ukrainian skeptic political parties and back them as much as possible. They only need a few minority seats if there's a potential for them to get into coalition government to have an influence far and above what the voting population is saying. And we've got the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, and they are almost pro-Russian in a lot of their output. They're Ukrainian skeptics in what they're doing. We will see a surge for AfD in different areas, I think, and a lot of that will be backed not overtly, but under the radar by Russian influence operations as well, because they want that. The same thing's happening across the whole of Europe. We saw it with Geert Wilders in Netherlands, but he is providing tacit or sort of unrelenting support for Ukraine. But Russia's balancing this off very, very carefully indeed. And whilst Europe is focused on domestic elections and domestic politics, then those countries are not focusing on what is happening inside Ukraine and its international politics. So it's taking political capital away from things at a time when Trump's coming in. And you rightly say, Trump will be looking at things and going, there are 3 conflicts around the world that the world is expecting the United States to try and deal with. We've got in Europe with Ukraine, we've got the Middle East that's blowing up, and we've got Southeast Asia with tensions around Taiwan and elsewhere. Trump traditionally has not got on well with China in the slightest. The Middle East is one of his biggest worries because oil supplies will have the biggest impact and oil prices will have the biggest impact on the US economy. And he's probably rightly turning around to Europe and the European members of NATO and saying, hey, folks, come on, you take on one of these conflicts, we will continue to support it, but come on, take the lead on it so that we can focus on the others because they all affect you. And I think we'll see more of that coming out of Trump.
We'll come on to Trump in just a moment. Just finally on the ATACMS, how do you think Vladimir Putin will be reacting to this in the Kremlin? Because, for months now, he might have thought he's got away with this and that he won't have these long-range missiles sanctioned by the US, and now it's happened. How do you think he will be feeling in response to this?
Well, it's interesting. I saw Putin's body language whenever he was first told about it, and he was shocked. He's been shocked by a number of different things. I think this telephone call that allegedly happened between Trump and Putin, which Putin's team has denied ever happened, resulted in nude pictures of Melania Trump being plastered all over Russian national television. That, from an old spy's perspective, which Putin is sending a threat and a warning back to Trump, saying, if I'm going to do this, then watch out for what will come next. Putin will not be happy that this decision has been made. And it wouldn't surprise me if Trump's team has actually influenced Biden's team under the table to get this decision made now so that Trump doesn't have to do it and it leaves him more negotiating room in different things. These sorts of levels of decision are not going to happen in complete isolation as we're in a transitional period between presidents. The whole thing is fascinating. Putin, I think, is concerned and won't really know where to maneuver. So that's why we'll hear the standard rhetoric starting to come out as he tries to work out what to do. He'll increase his attacks against Ukraine. He'll try and punish them for this, but he's already started that against infrastructure. He'll be hoping that that will have some form of impact. But I think at the moment, he doesn't know where to maneuver, which is good because that means he doesn't have the initiative. The pace is being dictated by the international community and by the Ukrainians. And he's hurting. That's why he's relying on North Korea now for troops, on recruiting in Africa for troops, on North Korea for ammunition, for the Iranians for drone technology, and the Chinese for other technology. It will be costing him economically dear.
Well, let's come on to Donald Trump and what a second Trump administration will mean for Ukraine. President Zelensky said over the weekend he thinks it'll mean now that the war will end sooner because of Trump in the White House. Do you agree with that?
I think it will, but I don't think the conditions are right for it to end yet. And I think there's a lot of rhetoric around comments that Trump made when he was president, first of all, where he was actually just trying to bully the international community and bully NATO and NATO members into making sure that they paid their 2% of GDP, as they agreed to when they became members of NATO, into defence, to stop the US having to fund everything. Not every NATO member has done that, so we'll see more threats against NATO and against the international community. Trump is a businessman and he approaches things from a business perspective. So if we look at the investment that's going into the US defense industrial base, it's needed because of the instability that's growing around the world. And the Democrats had started to reduce the amount of spending. Trump came in on a flag of building up US military capability. And a big part of that is this defense industrial base. So you can make enough ammunition, you can make enough missiles, you can make enough pieces of equipment. A lot of the money that's being spent on Ukraine, that $60 billion, has not been given to Vladimir Zelensky as a check where he puts it in his bank account and spends it as he wants to. It's actually being spent in the United States, in US defense industrial base, creating jobs, creating manufacturing capacity, creating support industries, and generating taxpayers, additional taxpayers. That's giving tax revenue back into the US economy. So it's a good thing. Trump's not going to take that away. He's not going to create mass unemployment in his defense industrial base. He'll make lots of sounds about stopping war, but war, unfortunately, is economically good for the United States and elsewhere. So I think we'll see him continuing that, but he will be concerned about 3 conflicts around the world and the US being expected to try and deal with all 3 of them, and he'll want other countries, especially ones which have got huge economic power, to build their defence industrial bases up and to start to take some responsibility. And that's why I think we're seeing the next deployment of the UK carrier battle group going down to Southeast Asia to try and release some of the tension from US carrier battle groups around Pacific and around what's going on in Taiwan. The French carrier battle group is planning to do exactly the same. So we're trying to see a level of burden sharing and that going out for political statements. That's what Trump will like. But he doesn't particularly like the EU because he sees it as a trading bloc rival. He will see the build-up of the defence industrial base in Europe as something that's necessary, but he'll also see it as competition to the United States and what's coming out of there. So that'll be an interesting balance to see. He won't feel comfortable with the government in the UK acting as the bridge because, in simplistic American terms, and unfortunately, our cousins will try and take the complexities of British politics and simplify them into American speak. In American speak, Labour Party equals the Democrats, Starmer equals Biden, Harris. The Conservative Party equals the Republicans, Boris Johnson equals Trump. And that's the way that he will think and his team will think as they try to look at the difference of policy. So it's going to take very, very hard work, I think, from Keir Starmer and David Lammy to maintain a strong political and economic relationship with America, given that. And it will mean that they will probably have to suggest that they are more right of centre than they're coming out with. It will be interesting times, I think.
It's really interesting getting your assessment, Philip, on what a Trump presidency will mean for Ukraine, because, I've picked up from a lot of analysts in the past fortnight since the US election, maybe more optimism or maybe less pessimism is maybe the way of putting it about what a Trump presidency means for Ukraine than maybe there was before. And maybe people had took too literally past comments about I'll end the war in 24 hours or whatever. Is that a fair assessment of how you view things, that Trump has a more complicated relationship with Ukraine than sometimes we give him credit for?
Yeah, Trump's got a more complicated relationship with Ukraine and with Russia and with lots of other things. And he doesn't think like a politician. And that's what really worries people. I do think, if you compare the two, you compare Harris to him, Harris would have probably continued with the Biden type approach. And therefore, there would have been uncertainty in supply of weapons. There would have been periods of time when there would have been hiatus, especially if there wasn't majorities across the House, which the different houses, which there isn't. And that would have probably created greater pain for Ukraine. At least with Trump, there will be a degree of certainty once he starts to get his policies out there. And that is what Ukraine needs, and that's what the international community needs. The biggest threat to the international world order with Trump is his unpredictability. People or politicians like to be able to predict how someone is going to react to different things, and that they'll formulate their policies and create their papers and hold their meetings and have their positions to take all around that. With Trump, they can't do it. And that means that our politicians are going to have to think on their feet, and not necessarily react to whatever he says, but try and put that into context. That is politically challenging. I think Zelensky, if anyone, he can see a path to playing Trump to make sure that he gets support, because it's almost certain that Trump will get Putin and get Zelensky and metaphorically crash their heads together and say, you two come up with a peace plan. Zelensky, if he's smart, will turn around and say, yep, I'm happy to negotiate. Let's get some plans on the table, and I will give some ground. Putin will come in and say, here's my peace plan. I'm keeping everything that I've got. And by the way, I want another chunk, and will give no ground. And if he gives no ground and Zelensky's saying, hey, but I'm willing to negotiate, then Trump is put in a position where he's going to have to continue to support Zelensky and support him more aggressively. And I think Zelensky's got the wider diplomatic skills and the people skills to understand that and to play it to his good effect.
Just as we round off this conversation, Philip, obviously we've spoken a lot about the geopolitics of the situation. Just to focus on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine currently, how would you assess the situation on the front line, particularly in the east?
In the east, the Russians have got the initiative. The Russians are advancing slowly, very slowly. It's costing them a lot. It's costing them between 1,700 and 2,000 troops a day being killed or severely wounded. They're still losing huge numbers of pieces of equipment. They're making small advances in retaking Kursk, the Kursk region again, but again at huge, huge cost. They're running out of capability and running out of troops. But Russia still retains the tactical initiative. Ukraine had it last year whenever they carried that incursion out into Kursk. That sort of dislocated what the Russians were planning to do, but they've just kept up this meat grinder. We're now hitting a point where that will probably continue, but then as winter gets in, Russia will advance even more and more and more slowly because it just saps the energy out of its troops. However, this conflict is not going to be won at a or lost at a tactical level. It's going to be won or lost at what happens at an operational level or a strategic level. And this is where Ukraine retains the initiative in dealing with things. It is dictating the pace of what's happening in different places like that. And again, if we compare this to similar conflicts in history or other conflicts in history, during Vietnam, the US didn't lose a single tactical battle, but they lost the war. They lost the conflict. During Afghanistan, I don't think Allied troops in Afghanistan against the Taliban lost a single tactical battle. But who now controls Afghanistan? And therefore, we can't measure things purely on what is happening on the front line. We have to look at this much more in a 3D or 4D or 5D perspective because it is a very, very complex war.
It's a very good point you raise. I mean, just on sort of the tactical battles, there's an interesting report that the Institute for the Study of War have just published in recent days looking at how the Ukrainian defense of Pokrovsk actually shows that it's kind of forced Russia into changing its approach in eastern Ukraine. And for the best part of 8 months now, they've been throwing almost everything at Pokrovsk, including during the period where there was a lag in Western military aid. And yet they still haven't been able to capture it yet. And they're changing their approach, they're trying to envelop it and all of that kind of stuff. But does the fact that Ukraine has been able to hold on to Pokrovsk actually go to show that Ukraine is very much still in this on a tactical level in the east, despite all the challenges that you've described? Ukraine still is fighting very hard.
Oh, very much so. And if you get into examining each of the tactical battles around the place, you look at what Ukraine managed to do in Bakhmut. It kept Russia fixed on Bakhmut for over a year. And use that as a meat grinder. Petrovsk is now the new Bakhmut. Now it shows that Russia has got the ability to analyze what it's doing and then change its tactics and approach it, and will happily do that in a way that is illogical to any normal military because it doesn't care about casualty numbers. And that is a short-term view, because they will run out of experienced troops, and they'll run out of all troops at some stage. But Ukraine is continuing to defend and adapt its defense in a way that it is keeping the Russians fixed. They understand how the Russians work. They understand their mentality, and they're playing them quite nicely. And Ukraine is also using this time. I see it as trading space for time at the minute. There are numbers of Ukrainian troops out being trained around Europe at formation level. There's a report I read in the last few days of a complete Ukrainian brigade being trained in France, for all arms combat at brigade level. That's over 2,000 troops with all of their equipment and all the rest of it that are not on the front line, that are being prepared for something else in the future. And that's only going to be one group of people that are being trained. So Ukraine has shown the whole way through this almost 1,000 days of conflict that it is very good at trading space for time and using that time to good effect to get prepared for what it wants to do next. But is it ever going to get to a point where, from a tactical perspective, it can push the Russians back and then push them out of the country? No. This is going to be a balance between what goes on at the tactical level, the operational level, which Ukraine is having major success at with its special operations, executive type operations, and its destruction of a third of the Black Sea fleet, and even more being damaged, it damaging Russia's defense industrial base and logistic bases and oil refining and everything else. And then at the strategic level, the politics. And only when Trump gets in and starts to set his position because of US's global position in politics will that be able to sort of sort itself out. But I can see Zelensky beginning to maneuver at the moment and get himself positioned in exactly the right position to be able to exploit whatever line that takes.
And just finally, I suppose the other thing to reiterate, which we've spoken about a lot over recent years, which is the Russian casualty rate, which is so high that it is putting a pressure on Putin. And that, if Trump is trying to force him into a kind of negotiation and forcing him to try and swallow things that he may not want to swallow, he may be pushed into that, because the other alternative, which is to keep fighting and potentially have to look at a fresh wave of mobilization, is also very unattractive to Vladimir Putin.
It is, but we also have to remember that Putin is living inside, his own little bubble that is not necessarily connected to the outside world, and therefore he's getting fed what he wants to hear. And those that feed him stuff that he doesn't want to hear tend to take up window cleaning jobs and fall out the 9th floor window, or decide that next weekend's the weekend that they're going to have a heart attack. And that creates a very difficult position to try and get the truth in, to get someone into a position where they feel as if they need to negotiate. At the moment, he's managed to keep the conflict away from the Muscovites, from those that are the power-based supporters inside Moscow, and is using people from elsewhere. He's now having to recruit heavily using the rump of his Wagner group in Africa to get Africans to come in and provide manpower. He's got North Korea coming in to provide manpower. And there's reports in the papers only today that North Korea may be looking at providing up to 100,000 troops. That is a real testament to just how bad a position Putin is in. But whether he can be forced to give concessions or not without him losing his position as president of Russia, I don't know. I don't think so.
Philip, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.